just want to welcome everyone to the Hilltopper Vote Forum. We're very excited about this. We have an excellent panel. I would like to introduce the president of St. Edward's University, Dr. Martin, and he would just like to give you some brief comments and remarks for the panel and for those that are attending this evening.
So good evening, everybody. It's great to have you all here in this virtual setting. It's hard to say how many people are here or anything else, but it's the way we do things these days. First, I want to thank the BSS Symposium and Pi Sigma Alpha for sponsoring this program. I want to thank you all for your invitation, inviting me to join you tonight. I'm very much looking forward to a very impressive panel of speakers that we have this evening, and welcome to them to our virtual campus. I hope that you've had an opportunity to come on our real live campus, either prior to this or perhaps sometime in the future. I was tempted to start by saying that no time in history has as an election been this important. And then I caught myself, my historian part of me caught myself. And I said, well, it really was important that George Washington was elected president, and it really was important that Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and it really was important that FDR was elected president. So while I can't say it's the most important, I'd say it's equal to those instances in terms of the future of our country. And I am so grateful that we have a symposium like this to inform potential voters. I hope everybody gets out to vote. And thank you again for doing this. So it's a great honor for the university to sponsor this and be at the work, using the work of the faculty and the students in the School of Social Sciences, so Social and Behavioral Sciences. So with that, I'm going to get out of your way and let you do the important thing and get these speakers on and tell us what we need to worry about and anticipate. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And thank you for coming this evening. We have a really good panel. I want to introduce the panel now and just briefly make some comments about each one and the background of each of the panelists. I'll start with the Travis County Clerk, Dana DeBeauvoir. Ms. DeBeauvoir has been a county clerk since 1986 and has served a number of different avenues in elections all over the world. Very fascinating things. She worked in South Africa during the shift away from apartheid, and worked in many of the Eastern European countries in their voting patterns, and as a consultant and as an observer in those countries that were in transition. So it's fascinating, and I'm really curious to get your take on some things comparing voting behavior and voting patterns across the world. So first of all, just thank you and welcome to the forum. The second guest to this evening is Ross Ramsey. And Ross is the co-founder of the Texas Tribune and the executive editor of the Texas Tribune. And I would find it really hard to believe that anyone that has an interest in politics would not know about the Texas Tribune and would not know who Ross Ramsey is. So there are many things that Ross has done in politics and covering Texas politics for several years, but certainly the Texas Tribune is the most prominent and well-known outlet for politics in Texas. Moriah Powers is here also from the League of Women Voters, Austin area. She's the president of the League of Women Voters. And as we'll discuss with Moriah, the League of Women Voters plays a critical role in understanding the ballot, understanding how good decisions are being made as citizens go to the poll. And then finally, last but not least, is Eric Bustos. Eric is the government relations manager for Capital Metro. And I'll add, a St. Ed's grad. So this is very, very exciting for us here at St. Ed's to have a St. Ed's grad in such a prominent position on such a very, very highly, publicized issue at Proposition A. So, so thank you all for coming. I also have on the call Dean Catherine Campbell, who is the Dean of the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences. And then, as Dr. Martin pointed out, this is sponsored by the Behavioral Social Sciences Symposium, as well as the Political Science Honor Society Pi Sigma Alpha. The students put a lot of work into this, just so y'all know. They put a lot of work into it. And so that the credit goes to them for all the things that they've done on this. So I've talked a lot, so let me just jump right in here and ask the panel, if you wouldn't mind, individually, and if you don't mind maybe taking it in the order that I just went through. First, just kind of a warm-up question. You know, this is, as we know, this is one of the elections that the surge in the number of registered voters is almost 100% here in Travis County. It's 97%, I think, the figure that I saw. And nationwide, we're seeing a tremendous surge in early voting and absentee ballots being distributed. And so those kinds of things aren't the typical way that we look at the voting behavior, even in presidential elections. So if you look at college students today, what are some things that you would say as a first-time voter? What is some advice that you would give to a college student who's about to vote in this 2020 election? Dana?
All right, now can you hear me?
Yes.
I do have some advice for college students. The main thing I would say is plan your vote, because many of you are going to be voting by mail for the very first time, and it's a little bit complicated. By mail is not that voter friendly, so you want to take some time, and you'll only have that if you start the process early. You want to be able to do all of your research and then turn that ballot back around and mail it back as soon as possible. We all know that the post office has been damaged recently, and there are a lot of places, election offices, that have added extra staff so that we can handle more of the ballot by mail and take some of the pressure off of the Postal Service. The other thing I would say is, there's a lot of unpleasantness going on right now in social media. The best thing for especially our young voters to do, and if this is their first time to participate, just tune out all that ugliness and go and do the only thing that you can do as a voter to participate in our democracy. You just go vote.
I would echo some of that. I would say, vote early would be my advice. The lines were really big, as you would expect on the first day of voting. Someone told me this afternoon that statewide, 2 million people have already voted. We only had 9 million people vote in 2016. So it's hard to tell right now whether that's going to be a big turnout all the way across or whether people are just busting at the seams and they're front loading their votes. But people are voting, and you've got a couple of weeks here where if you're not voting by mail, you can vote early, and you can vote at the most boring time of the day and maybe not face a line. So I would say, as part of planning your vote, I would say get out there and vote. Look at the issues on the bottom of the ballot. We've all been hearing a bunch of stuff, probably more than we want to hear about the presidential race, a lot of stuff about races at the top. And your chances of knowing what's going on the ballot, no matter who you are, unless you're a candidate or you're a candidate's family member, gets smaller and smaller as you go down the ballot, and you eventually get to a bunch of names you don't know. And that's where voters can make real mistakes or really have an impact, because a lot of voters don't make it that far. If you vote in down ballot races where you've done your homework, you can have an outsized impact on things. And remember that this isn't just a federal election. There's a lot of state offices on the ballot this time, a lot of local offices, school boards are on the ballot. A friend of mine says the heavy smokers won't make it to the end because it's so long, but there's a lot of really important stuff on there, and I'd say study up a little bit before you go.
And to that point, I would say go to vote411.org, which is the League of Women Voters resource that provides you a customized ballot based on your address. You can pull up and see all the races that are going to be on your ballot, and it'll give you candidate responses so you can get to know those candidates, look at explanations of the propositions that will be on your ballot, print out your selections so that you have them ready to go, and you can keep that line moving once you're there. And I certainly understand the social anxiety of going to vote the first time you're casting a vote. So take a friend with you, maybe get somebody else civically engaged, and that way you've got someone with you that you won't lose your nerve when you get there and the line looks long and you don't know how this voting machine works. So take a friend. Don't give up. It's easy once you get it done the first time.
Wow, so much great stuff was already said. I'll try and, I guess, double down on some of it, which is, obviously make a plan. I think really also look at locations, and the county's got a great, if you're trying to avoid the line, the county's got a great online resource to show you, where things might be backed up or where the line is smaller. And so that's a great thing I would encourage everyone to check out. And of course, the League of Women Voters Guide you can't beat it. It's really detailed and goes down throughout the ballot. And per Ross's point, I really appreciate Ross for saying go all the way to the bottom of the ballot. That's definitely appreciated. But in all seriousness, it's important because there's no straight ticket voting this time. And so please, I would encourage folks, to definitely make it as far down the ballot as you can, obviously all the way, because it's really important to make your voice heard in all of those races.
I want to follow up, if I can, just with Moriah for just a second, because a lot of college students and really a lot of Texans do not know about the League of Women Voters and the kinds of things that you provide for voters. Can you talk just a little bit about your organization and why someone that might be skeptical about the information that you have can be, how you could overcome that skepticism with your organization? What's the purpose of your organization, and then what do you provide to the voters in Texas?
So we're a nonpartisan political organization, and we have multiple levels. So we've got the National League, and then the State League, and then local leagues. And so what we do is we compile information specifically for the Voters Guide and Vote 411. We compile information from the candidates, and then it trickles down. So the National League will get the information from those national level candidates and brings that down. And then at the local level, we've compiled the information from all the local candidates. And because we're nonpartisan, we send that information out to all of the candidates that have met the guidelines, such as the FEC fundraising and things like that. If they've met the guidelines to provide responses, then we're reaching out to all of them. We're not leaning any way, we're giving you all of the information. And in terms of like proposition explanations, we're not trying to give you like, we are supporting this proposition. We're going to give you the pros and cons, an explanation so that you can decide as the voter what candidates align with your values, which propositions you're in support of or not in support of based on the information that we've given. We simply want you to be informed.
Mm-hmm. And, when we think about the kind of the voting process, how the voting process works, we obviously have many students, and I think all of us are, we have to go through a process of registering. We have all elements of actually finding avenues of going to a voting location. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in how some people view the voting process. So I'm wondering, Dana, would you mind talking about the Travis County voting process? There's been some questions about nationally and then statewide, and obviously even on the county level, on whether the process is secure, whether it's transparent, and whether it is accountable. Can you talk about how the county, what you do at the county clerk's office to ensure all three of those values?
I certainly can. Let's start with by mail, because that's where you heard the most noise about how by mail is somehow different from everything else and therefore more vulnerable. Every by-mail ballot has to go through the same double checks as when you are voting inside the polling place. So you have to be on the voter registration roll, find you, and vote that particular ballot. You have to provide your signature as the swearing in, just like when you sign in at the polling place, that all of your information is correct. And then once your voted by-mail ballot comes back in, we do the same thing all over again. It's verified against the voter registration database. A list of all of the names of the ballots that have come in is created just like the polling place list. And I think a lot of people don't realize that by-mail ballots go through the exact same procedures as in person. Now, in person, what voters are going to find when they go is it'll be socially distanced, that everybody's going to be masked, that we really feel like we are able to offer a very safe opportunity to vote in person. And if you will check votetravis.com, you can find out which of the locations have the shortest line and which of the locations have the longest line, and you'll want to avoid all of the red icon labeled longer lines in favor of another place. Pick something that's convenient for you. But if we spread out our turnout among all of our 37 locations, there will be less lines for everyone.
With the number of voters that have eligible voters that have actually registered to vote, a record number, which is incredible, but with also the polling locations being more limited with respect to where voters can go, do you see any potential problems with someone being able to go to the poll and be able to vote in the process? Are there problems with access?
Well, I certainly hope not, because we have 37 early voting locations throughout Travis County, and that's the most we've ever had. We usually have between about 30 and 34 locations, so we have extras this time, and they're in larger facilities. So we've got room to socially distance and room for people to park. And there were a lot of new places. So we want voters to go and check before they go out. Don't make the assumption you know where you're going to go. Check where you're going to go and pick the place with the lowest turnout. We also have 178 election day vote centers. That's more than we've ever had in the past too. And we would encourage people to take advantage of vote centers because you can go anywhere to one of those vote centers on election day. You're not limited to just your neighborhood. Those are both really great ways for voters to get voting done. And if you have voted a by-mail ballot and you have this situation where you're a little concerned about going and voting in person, and yet you also got this situation where you've heard about the post office. And so what can we do for voters who have been placed in that squeeze play? What we do is offer hand delivery at 5501 Airport Boulevard. It's been very popular. We're thrilled that we were able to bring it to you after the governor tried to torpedo it. We're still up and running. And voters are finding that this 2-minute drop-off option, it takes 2 minutes per car to process voter ID, you sign a list, you watch your ballot being put directly in the ballot box. Again, by mail hand delivery is also being conducted with all of the same audits and controls that you will find inside the polling place.
So you brought up the governor, and there's been a lot of legal maneuvering, both on the part of the drop-off locations, with several courts making varying decisions on that. And ultimately, the decision was that there would be single locations rather than multiple locations by county. And the other side of it was the extension of early voting, that the governor extended voting, but in the Republican Party, there were some in the Republican Party that actually wanted to limit that. How do you see that those kinds of issues in Travis County? Do you see, when we talk about it, I guess this is for the whole panel really, but I would love to hear your comments first, Dana. Where do you see these kinds of issues when students are in American government class, for example? We talk a lot about how there are many limits in the American voting process that are different than other parts of the world. Voter registration, for example, one of those, having a limited number of days to vote. Do you see these kinds of things Should we expand voting? Should we have other kinds of means of voting? Are there secure ways to vote, for example, online and other kinds of approaches to voting that you see would be a better way to improve voter turnout and improve participation?
To improve participation, what we need is to offer voters as many options for taking advantage of their right to participate in the democracy as we can possibly think of. So just in person isn't enough. We need to make sure voters can get to all of the locations, and the options to hand deliver and the options to surrender your by-mail ballot at a polling place if you want to. If we use every option we can find, then that makes it a whole lot easier for all of our voters to participate. I'm very concerned about the governor's latest actions, taking away those options in the middle of the first day abruptly without any notice was not something that was good for voters. Perhaps it was good for the Republican Party, but certainly not for voters. And then we've had this sort of herky-jerky thing going on where the state courts say, yes, voters should have more than one place to drop off their ballot. And then the AG immediately appeals, and immediately the Fifth Circuit quashes it again. So we're all sort of feeling that pull and tug between the political entities. And my concern is, okay, in the midst of all of that, how do we take care of voters and still offer them as many options as possible? The one thing you did mention about voting online, there's not anybody that really has an online presence right now because the current internet that we have is not safe enough for internet voting. If we were to try to do that right now, we would get hacked. And the other thing I would say is that in the United States, we are particularly known for our people-conducted elections. We really don't have that much administration, or certainly not military, that actually conducts our election, and that's the way it is in a lot of other countries. Never mind that their people are also, happy to wait in line. They will, participate in their democracies. Voters want some say over how their government operates. So, while it's all the same all over the world, keep in mind that the United States does have a better way to access the ballot than most other countries. And it's too bad that Texas is dead last in the ability for us to turn out to vote. We're really not a red state. We are a non-voting state.
Ross?
I think if they wanted you to vote, they would make it easier to vote. I think it's really that simple. And if the government was a business, I think that they would snap in and they would look at some of these things and say, well, this is inefficient, that's inefficient. Requiring everybody in Harris County to go to one place to drop an absentee ballot is like saying we're going to close every single McDonald's store except for one and expect them to sell the same number of hamburgers and French fries. It's just crazy. That's not how the world works. And I think, a lot of this doesn't really happen at the local level, so it's not really something as a policymaker that Dana's shop controls. This happens at the state level, and they decide how easy is it going to be to vote, how easy is it going to be to register to vote, what is the easiest way to make the voting secure in Texas. And I think if that was the question, you would have a much different voting system. I also think that there's enough frustration in this system that at some point they're going to have to, somebody's going to come in and say, this all has to go, we got to redesign this whole thing. And I don't think if you were designing a modern voting system, you would design the one we have. We start with one at whatever point, make up a date, 1865. And everything that we have now is basically an amendment of that system. And instead of taking it all apart and saying, okay, what would be the easiest way to do this? What's the simplest way for people to securely vote and to see what would happen if everybody got a chance to vote? I think we'd have a much different system. The frustrations with this system are that all of those changes that you might want in a voting system have to be put in place by people who were the beneficiaries of the voting system as it is. So if I got elected governor under this system, why would I change it? What's the point of that? In fact, I'd like to keep it exactly like it is. If I see a bunch of new people registering to vote, which we see this year, I think it's They haven't got a final number yet, but it's right at 17 million people in Texas registered to vote. Nobody really knows what would happen if 17 million people voted in Texas. I think it'd be fascinating. I don't know if we'd be a red state or a blue state. We'd be a pretty active civic state.
That's interesting. And you know, we think about one of the laws that is often discussed in a access question is the voter ID law. I'm actually getting some Q&A questions in on how they're registered in other states, but you know, we saw this a lot in the voter ID laws. Do you think that those are designed to improve security, or what's the purpose of those laws? Do you think that they're helpful in making sure that our elections are secure, or are they just a political tool to reduce the number of voters that go to the poll?
They make it more difficult for certain kinds of voters to get to the ballot. They increase the number of hurdles for certain kinds of voters. I don't have to show papers anywhere I go. I have to show a driver's license and a voter registration card. I don't have to show citizenship papers. I don't have citizenship papers. I was born in Amarillo, Texas. It seems like a foreign country now, but that's a whole different matter.
Okay.
You know, if you create these impediments for some people to vote, then those people are going to have fewer of those people are going to vote. You know, this should be a process of removing obstacles, except when you absolutely have to do something in order to secure the result. And
Yeah.
That's not how this works.
It's interesting in my classes, I talk about how the burden should be on those in an authority position. The burden should be on them to prove why access is being denied, why transparency is being denied, and why accountability is not being taken into the perspective. The burden should always be on those that are creating these obstacles to prove why those obstacles exist. But it seems like we do a lot of the reverse in these kinds of voter access pieces, because it seems like the burden is on the voter rather than on those that are putting those obstacles in place to prove why those are necessary.
Well, if you create an argument that voting is not secure, that a lot of cheating is going on, that there's a ton of fraud, that there's terrible things happening out there, and only we can protect you, then you've created that rationale. And you can write, I know that because we've done this, and we're certainly not the only ones who've done this, you can write that, look, there is anecdotal evidence of fraud in elections. There always has been. We have a member of Congress from Texas who was elected when they found a box of ballots behind a filing cabinet 2 days after the election. I don't know if the crime there was that there was a box of ballots behind a filing cabinet, or that they found the box of ballots behind the filing cabinet. We never figured that out. There's always something odd in elections. You know, there's a hanging chad here, or there's something there, but there's not a lot of fraud. And the fraud that is out there is, there's two things that are generally true about it. It's almost always caught. The reason you hear about it is because somebody went to jail. And it's almost always inconsequential. There's a couple of elections where the number of votes in contest because of some issue like that actually would decide an election. But most of the time, you know, most elections are decided by, you know, well over the margin of error being, you know, I don't know, ballot boxes behind file cabinets.
If I could just add one thing. Let's look at student IDs for just a minute in terms of proper ID for voting. There's no logical reason why the photo ID that most universities provide to their students could not be used for photo ID for these, you know, college age voters. Many of them don't have driver's licenses because they live in a place on campus where they don't need a car. It's, you know, there's not a logical reason why student IDs should be exempted. It's just another one of the obstacles that's thrown in front of voters. And I think the other thing is, when you look at the things that are accepted, like you can vote with an open carry gun permit, but not a student ID, that makes no sense at all.
Rob, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm sorry, did you say Moriah?
Right, yes.
Yeah, I mean, they've covered it. I agree completely with everything that they say. It's my opinion that it's not a true democracy until we're all voting. And when we're working within the framework of current voting systems, I understand that it's limited right now, but anything that you're doing that isn't expanding voter access is limiting it and is frankly voter suppression. So, I mean, these voter ID laws, limiting the drop-off locations when every drop-off location, I know Dana worked very hard to make sure everyone was just as secure as the one at Airport Boulevard. We have so many people in this county trying to drop off ballots, and limiting that to one location just doesn't make sense. So any of those things, anytime you're not finding a way to expand voter access, you're doing the opposite, and you're harming democracy.
Moriah, your group obviously is information first, nonpartisan, neutral with respect to providing opportunities. But do you have campaigns and groups that resist or want to either not participate in your voter guide or question the integrity of the organization, or a hidden bias that they may want to express about the League of Women Voters?
We have had at some points some candidates respond and say that they're not interested in responding because they feel like including all candidates gives a spotlight to the other party, and so they don't want to be involved in any publication that would give an equal spotlight to their opposition. We have had others that feel like we lean a certain direction, which we strive very hard in our nonpartisanship. So, and we are equal in all respects to all parties and candidates. So we do hear it. There's obviously, in our opinion, not a lot of basis to it, but it does happen sometimes.
Yeah, and I think when you think about your role as information distributing, information, as we know, is power. And as you think about candidates that would much rather limit the information to the information that they are distributing or distributing about their opponent, it's often a threat to the candidate, especially when it's information that is neutral and unbiased and asked similar, if not the exact same questions of the candidates, and let the public make the decision. And so information, just like other areas of our democratic system, is always the antidote to the propaganda and information that is manipulative. And I think we see this now, obviously, the nature of propaganda and social media and other aspects where we know that there is a very strong push on multiple fronts on all different sides of the spectrum. Do you have a social media account that the League of Women Voters uses that students can look at and go to?
We do, both at our local level as well as the state and national level. We're on, we're not on TikTok yet, but we do have Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, YouTube. We're on most of the old school social media. And actually, to what you were saying, we've actually run a campaign this year trying to inform people about the level of misinformation and disinformation that's out there, and to make sure that whatever this source is, that you're doing the homework yourself to make sure that it's credible, and to avoid sharing something before you verified that, because that in itself is harmful, and a lot of the information that's out there is just false.
That's really interesting, and I think that's a really important part of this. In thinking about being informed is also being thoughtful in how you distribute, how the citizen distributes information. Ultimately, is the final decision maker on how information is distributed. That's really interesting that you're doing that. Eric, I want to turn to you. If you want to answer this, Eric, you're welcome to. And if it's really up to you, if you want to start with that. And then I'd like for you to, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to the ballot itself. And I'd like for Eric to just talk about Proposition A and what Proposition A is, for voters in Travis County, and also for if you don't mind, I know, and you obviously, if you would like to talk about Proposition B, you're welcome to as well.
Well, I would just say on the topic we were just discussing, I couldn't agree with the clerk more about the importance of options. You know, I think I guess mail-in voting is controversial right now, but I have a good friend who's an alumni also who lives in Oregon, and I want to say they are the highest turnout state, or per capita turnout state, and it's all mail voting. And so I personally like going in the voting booth. So to me, I think it's options, being able to vote by mail if you want, or come in person. I think all of the above, right? And then of course, making Election Day a holiday, I think would be just personally really great. But no, I'm happy to kind of walk through Project Connect, as we call it, if you're ready to do that now. I have some slides I'd like to show. I'm a kind of a visual person, visual learner, going back to my St. Ed's days. So if it's okay, I'd like to just share a couple of visuals and to kind of help explain what's all in Project Connector in the package that's before the voters, that's currently on the ballot. If that's okay.
While you're pulling that up, Eric, let me just say what we're talking about is a proposition that's on the ballot, which is created by the city council, that includes an attachment of a bond that would fund a particular project. And so in this case, Eric is about to talk about the bond, where the bond money will go, and how that bond will go towards this particular project.
Slight correction, it's actually a tax rate election.
Oh,
and
yeah.
a big reason for that, to get a little technical here, I'm going to keep it pretty high level. So I'll just say, if folks want to dig into the details, please go to projectconnect.com. Or if you want to get specific on the proposition, which is Proposition A, you can go to the city's website, which is austintexas.gov/2020 Prop A. Especially they really go into the finances on that website. But the reason why we as staff felt and recommended to the policymakers and went with a tax rate relation versus a bond is because bonds legally can only be used for capital costs. And in order to get federal funding and be competitive, it's extremely important that you have a long-term revenue source identified for operations and maintenance. Because once you build the thing, you've got to be able to keep it running for decades. And so that's why we went with the tax rate election, so we would have a long-term revenue source to provide that operation and maintenance funding that's critical for the federal process that we'll be going through, hopefully after the election, if the voters approve the measure. So again, I'm going to kind of quickly go through this because I know it's, no PowerPoints aren't always the funnest thing, but I think it's just important to kind of show some of this stuff visually. And, first just want to kind of talk about how it came together. I think one of the important lessons we learned from past non-successful attempts at doing a expansion of the transit system is really bringing the community along with us. So over the past 4 years, we've been developing this program in concert with the community. And so we've engaged over 60,000 Austin residents in that time. And as far as we can tell, it's the largest community engagement effort done in the city for an item or project like this. And then over the summer, during the pandemic, we specifically engaged 17,000 people virtually. And the reason why that's important is because those were the months when we were deciding, taking the system into deciding what the package would be, or the final plan we would put before voters. So that specific engagement was very critical. And then of course that was done in collaboration with community leaders, lots of other stakeholders and organizations, and of course our partner agencies and governments. So how did it come together? Well, all of that community engagement really culminated back in June when our board, the Cat Metro Board, and the City Council adopted a comprehensive system plan. But of course, that wasn't the end of the road, because then those policymakers needed to decide, and staff made a recommendation on what elements of that plan to ultimately fund. And that decision was made in August. And as you know, pretty much that was when they said, hey, this is what we actually want to send to voters for their consideration to fund which elements of that system. And so, of course, again, like I said, that's what's on the ballot this November. So just really quickly, what's in the initial investment? Well, first, we're going to be investing in our current commuter rail line. I was joking with David before about that. You know, I think the important difference to understand that I'll explain a little or visualize a little bit later is commuter rail is really about bringing folks in outlying communities into the downtown or urban area during peak or during rush hour. Essentially, like it's pretty self-explanatory commuter service. So we're going to be adding some stations to that line, and then we'll be adding a completely new commuter rail line called the Green Line, and that's envisioned to take people from downtown or basically the eastern part of Austin all the way to Colony Park through East Austin into downtown. But then we're also going to be adding 2 new light rail lines. And again, the difference between that and commuter is light rail is intended for the urban environment, more frequent, more stops. But just like commuter rail, it runs at its own guideway. And so the orange line is really the spine of the system. It's actually, just to go back in history, it's kind of what was proposed in 2000 that was rejected by voters, and it essentially follows our current 801 route. I'm sure St. Ed students are probably familiar with that since there's a stop right outside campus, and that goes from, it's going to go from the North Lamar Transit Center down Lamar through downtown and then down through South Congress. And then the blue line, which is the other light rail line, would go from the airport down Riverside Drive across the lake, and then follow the same alignment as the orange line up North Lamar to our North Lamar Transit Center at 183. And then those 2 light rail lines, the orange and the blue, would utilize a downtown tunnel. The tunnels, of course, you know, have a big cost of the system, but staff felt it was very important to include because we know the most congested part of our city is, of course, the downtown core. And so this will ensure that those 2 light rail lines are not able to make traffic worse, and then obviously are able to, you know, easily get through the most congested part of our city. And then, of course, there will be expanding the bus network too. And that includes 4 new Metro Rapid routes, again, just like the 801 that you see today outside St. Ed's. One of those routes is with the Gold Line, which in the original system plan was recommended as light rail. But for the initial system, we didn't feel like the data or the ridership warranted that at the time. So it's going to be starting off as a Metro Rapid, but will be thought through in terms of being able to be converted to light rail in the future. And then there'll be 3 new express routes. Those are commuter routes. If you've ever seen kind of, we call them over-the-road coaches. They're very big red buses that travel on Mopac and take folks from suburban areas into the core as well, similar to that commuter rail service. And then 9 new park and rides and 1 new transit center. And then, of course, Project Connect envisions all of these vehicles, the buses and the light rail vehicles, to be all electric. And our board has actually already made a commitment, you know, regardless of how the referendum plays out, that every bus purchase we do going forward, and we've already made a few, will only be for electric buses. So we're pretty excited about that. And then 15 new neighborhood circulator zones. We have some of these already. It's called our pickup service. So the idea of this is kind of like an Uber Lyft service, but our vehicle is completely ADA accessible, where if you within a zone or a neighborhood, we will pick you up at your door and drop you off anywhere within the zone. And the idea here for Project Connect is to provide service to less dense areas as a way for them to connect in to the bigger system. So while you could certainly take the service to pick you up at your house and take you to a grocery store if you want, the ideal is that you would be using the service to connect you to one of these larger lines. And then some of you might be familiar with or seen B-Cycle in Austin. Recently, Capital Metro and the city have kind of partnered on that and are rebranding it Metro Bike. And we'll be converting all those bikes to electric bikes. And so the idea is to integrate that system into this as well. And then of course, the continuation of our Metro Access service, which is for folks with disabilities who couldn't otherwise use the buses or the trains. We provided door-to-door service for that. And of course, in the initial investment plan, we'll be funding a maintenance facility so we can take care of all these assets long-term. I know that was a lot, but I think it's really important to kind of itemize that. And so here is kind of a visualization to just show you or give you an idea of what light rail could look like in our urban environments. So I'll just pause there because I think that's a really striking image. Here we have kind of what we call split platform. So a platform on one end and a platform further down for people that are going either east, west, north, south. And then I'll just kind of conclude with kind of just showing you the full map. So when you see these kind of dotted lines, these are lines that are in the system plan but aren't considered as part of the initial investment. But our idea would be to, of course, eventually build this all out by identifying funding sources in the future. So the solid lines are the part that's in the package or what's in the referendum in front of voters right now. So you can kind of see those lines I described, the orange and blue line that share North Lamar, the tunnel downtown, the two commuter lines, the red and the green, and of course those purple lines are the Metro Rapid lines. And so here you can kind of see South Austin and of course that stop there at St. Ed's. And so what's kind of interesting here, I'll kind of specifically point out, is so when the gold line, if it ever becomes light rail, we would intend for it to, we call it interlining, but essentially operate in that same space to provide more frequency and more light rail capacity, just like on the northern section where the blue and orange overlap, the gold would overlap with the orange in the south. And so in the future, St. Ed's would not only have one light rail line, but two light rail lines connecting it to the rest of the city. And that is, and so I'll just actually go back a little bit and just kind of point out these circles that are meant to illustrate how different lines connect. Because again, the reason why the name is Project Connect is the idea is to create a system of lines that all connect together so that people have options to get around the city and get to where they need to go. And so that's essentially the initial investment. And again, if you know, this is pretty high level. If you're really interested in the details and how the funding works and the governance, you know, please go to projectconnect.com or the city's website, which is austintexas.gov/2020 Prop A.
This is a very ambitious project. It obviously has long-term consequences for the city's future. You know, it's a game changer here in Austin. When we talk about light rail, it obviously is, you know, a major part of that is just the light rail part of it, but it's not the only part of the project. And so I'll actually start with you, Eric, and kind of move from out for the general discussion. But we are seeing higher voter turnout, and in most elections, when we have higher voter turnout, that is a good sign for the Democrats. Higher voter turnout generally reflects Democratic candidates tend to do well, and in the case of Prop A, you would think that Democrats are going to be likely supportive of this. So do you see this? Is this election the same, I guess, on the local level and on the state level and the national level as the traditional way that we tend to view election voter turnout? Do you think that this is a good sign for Prop A? Is this if we were predicting this, how would we view this election for the Democrats on local level, statewide level, and on the national level? And you can start with.
I think for us, of course, you know, transportation has historically been not a nonpartisan issue. Certainly projects, you know, become, you know, at the federal level become kind of contentious in terms of like horse trading and the like for funding. But, you know, we really feel like, and, you know, I think we've seen that transportation is an issue that impacts everyone. I think one of the things we didn't kind of go into in the first question a little bit is how, you know, a lot of politics and a lot of important things are actually happening at the local level. At the federal level, you know, there's big policies that get the flashy attention, but really the things that impact most people's lives happen at the local level. And so this is really an opportunity, or at least we hope, for the citizens to make a decision, like you said, about the future of the city and what kind of transportation options we want to have. You know, one of the things we talk about a lot over that 4-year period we've done the engagement is that we know, based on our regional planning agency, that Austin will be going from 2 million, the region, to 4 million in 20 years by 2040. And that's, you know, I know, you know, Austin, and there's a lot of talk about the growth in recent years, but that's typical that Austin doubles its population every generation. And so we always like to say that, you know, what do we want our city and our community to look like 20 years from now? And specifically in terms of mobility options, you know, I would think most people would say definitely pre-pandemic, and we've seen, you know, recent headlines of traffic coming back, that no one was happy about the status quo. So our hope is that voters, or at least our community, see this as an opportunity to, you know, choose a direction going forward.
You know, one thing about that, you know, when I was talking about people getting all the way to the bottom of the ballot, you don't have one turnout in an election like this. You have a really high turnout at the top of the ticket. This is the first election in Texas in ages that we don't have straight ticket voting, so people can't push one button and go all the way down the ballot. And the electorate at the top of the ballot's the intensely interested in the presidential election electorate. At the bottom of the ballot, it's the people that are intensely interested in Prop A and things like that. And you're going to get the people who are the first people you're going to get in an election like that are the people who are really worked up about it. Presidential race, everybody's worked up. Prop A, the people who are for it are really worked up, and the people who are against it are really worked up. And this is where a voter has outsized influence, because you're in a smaller electorate, you have a bigger voice.
Right. You have fallout on the ballot.
Right.
Where you have fewer people that are going to vote in those lower. They're going to say, I don't really know which one to do, so I'm just going to abstain from that part of the ballot.
I will say, if I could just jump in really quick, sorry to jump in again, but I will give the clerk some more credit. You know, they recently did new voting machines, which came with new software, and it's really great because there really aren't as many, like, I've been voting in Austin now for 10 years, and I think my ballot was only like maybe 3-4 pages, which is just great. I think that's one of the great new innovations that the clerk's office has done to make it easier, so it doesn't feel as much of a burden to keep going down the list there.
If I may just add to what Eric was saying, because we lost straight ticket voting, I felt like it was important for us to do everything we could to make it easy for voters to get through the entire ballot and come down to the last two items, which are Prop A and Prop B. So what we've done is, for all of the candidates that are unopposed, you're going to find them at the end of the candidate part of your ballot, all grouped together. So the first part of your ballot, and that top real estate of the ballot, is then reserved for the contested candidates. So voters in a few pages can get through the whole project where they're absolutely being asked for an opinion. And then all of the candidates' names who are unopposed are still listed on the ballot, and you can see who those folks are too. And then the last item on the ballot is Prop A and Prop B. Our new voting system not only offers a paper trail, which voters are called upon to voter verify, but it also, the ballot marking device asks you to go through each page. You have to go through each page before you get to the end, and then it's going to give you a summary screen at the end so that you can tell if you missed anything or if there's a choice that you want to make a change in.
Rod, you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, specifically regarding Prop A, and I'm sorry if this is about to put you on the spot, Eric, but I know we've been fielding so many questions, and I've been seeing so many things specifically from there are two large groups, you know, the one that's for and the one that's against Prop A, and the information that they're putting out regarding what the amount, the percentage of this tax increase, what they're saying is wildly different. And I find that there's not math to support one of them. It doesn't seem like good math. And that's one of the areas where a lot of times we're like, you've got to look into this. Please just stop sharing information and see if it makes sense before you're sharing it. Where I live, we're in a mud. We don't even get to vote on the props, unfortunately, because I would love to. But, and I'm, even in my neighborhood group, people are just talking so much about this tax increase. And I'm like, that's not accurate. You might want to double check it, because you're now sharing this with people, even though you're not voting on it. Now you're sharing this around. So I'm just wondering, Eric, what are y'all doing to kind of to curb that, to try to put more accurate information out there to combat all this false information that's flying around?
Sure. First, I can't let it go by the mud comment, just because if you really want to nerd out on disenfranchisement of voters, just think about the fact that you can live in a city but not get to vote for your city council members. So it's a whole nother discussion. But you know, I think, you know, what we've been directing people to, we've been doing a lot of stuff, but I think the easiest thing to direct, I think, the folks that are watching this webinar is, again, that city website. Because again, the city financial department is kind of like the official, like, they do the calculating just like the county does on their items as well. So if you go to that city website, austintexas.gov/2020 Prop A, there's actually a really great, if you scroll towards the bottom, there's a really great graphic they put together that really shows, and this is the important, I think, maybe difference in how people are talking about it. When you eventually one day own a home, you'll find that your property tax bill is made up of a bunch of different political subdivisions. And so what this graphic shows is how all of that lines up to your ultimate bill and where Prop A falls and the percentage overall of that accumulation of things. And so I think the graphic does a great job showing that. So we direct people to that. It's very easy consumable. But on top of that graphic, if you're a homeowner, you're able to enter in your home. There's a calculator. You can enter in your home value, and it'll tell you exactly what your taxes will be if Prop A is successful.
Let me ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn. We've got a lot of questions from people from the audience right now. I'm getting a lot of questions in. So I'm just going to ask one final question. It's really more of a down ballot question on how the state House is in a very tight, there's a lot of questions about whether this House will become flipped over to the Democrats. So Ross, I just want to get your thoughts on that, on whether you think the Democrats are going to make gains in the House enough to take the House and actually have a majority in the House.
You know, the House has 150 members in it. The Democrats had a really, really great election in this part of the ballot in 2018 and picked up 12 seats from Republicans. They picked up a few seats that the Democrats and the Republicans didn't think they were going to pick up. So they had a really good night. And, you know, most of the analysts in the parties and outside the parties thought it was going to be maybe 7 or 8 seats. Turns out to be 12. So the question this year is, can they improve by 9 seats, which is what they need to take a majority? Can they improve by 9 seats on the best year that they've had in a long, long time? And that's kind of a reach. There are a couple of reasons to believe that might be possible. If the presidential race is as close as it looks like it might be, that would help. But there are a lot of factors in this. A lot of them are local races. The most dangerous time to be an incumbent is in your first re-election race, because you haven't been in office long enough to do anything. So you're not famous for anything, really. And nobody knows who you are yet. So you don't really have a reputation, and you're kind of a sitting duck. So in an election like this, you've got these 12 Democrats who won last time for the first time. And in some of those cases, the Republicans are going hard at them. And you've got a number of Republicans who won by 100, 200, 300 votes, you know, out of 40,000 cast. and the Democrats are going hard at them, you know, I think it could go either way, honestly. I think it's safe to say that the next House of Representatives is going to be pretty evenly divided between the Democrats and the Republicans. The first thing they're going to do is elect a speaker. Speakers, you know, don't have to be from the majority party, but they're generally from the majority party. But I think the speaker, you know, whether it's a Republican House or a Democratic House, I think the next speaker is going to have a dozen or a dozen and a half votes from the other party. So if I'm a Republican speaker, I think I'm going to have 12 or 18 Democratic votes. And the way that plays into a couple of policy issues is there's always sort of a semi-loving, semi-hostile sibling relationship between the Senate and the House. It really is like watching brothers and sisters. And the House is going to be much less conservative than the Senate, even if it's Republican. It's going to be a leavening factor. And the House doesn't like to be pushed around. I mean, you know, all of us who've watched it for a long time, there's a moment in every legislative session where the collective middle fingers come up toward the Senate, and, you know, you kind of have a bad couple of days. So I think the House is going to be a leavening effect on the Senate. And I think the place where you're going to see a lasting effect of that is if the House is Democratic, they're going to have an ability to put their finger on the scale that they don't have right now. Right now, you've got a Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican governor. Republican bills pass. A Republican redistricting plan will pass. If the Democrats are in, then the Republicans in the governor's office and in the Senate are going to have to deal with them. And by deal, I mean they're going to have to negotiate. They're going to have to take less than they want. And if they don't, the House, a Democratic House, would have the ability to stop any kind of legislation, including redistricting, and really cause problems for the Republicans. So it would, you know, be an interesting petri dish when we get out of there. But I wouldn't hazard a guess on how it's going to go on election night. You know, some of these are so local that, you know, we're talking about all these high level things and they're arguing about a low water crossing on Spring Street. So you never know exactly how it's going to go.
That's very good. Well, I'd like to turn over to the questions from the audience because we have a lot, and I'm going to start with one. And these are, some are anonymous, some have names on them, but this is a question to you, Dana. And I'm just going to read you the question. Your term as Travis County Clerk is set to expire in 2023, and you'll watch technology is changing the way we look at the voting process. Do you see the voting system changing significantly to deter election interference? Will voting in America be hack safe?
The answer is yes, it will be hack safe. Here are the things, though, that we have to consider when we talk about that. First of all, if you're thinking that the equipment inside a polling place during early voting or election day is the target, none of the research, none of the previous efforts have shown that that is at all a reasonable or probable attack vector. It's simply not going to happen there. What will happen, though, is for anything that is connected to the internet, which is why we're not doing internet voting, then you may have a problem. And voter registration is the number one most vulnerable part. It's open 24/7 to the public, directly to the public. So we have to structure a lot of sniffing devices and protection procedures to make sure that nothing gets through to it. We want to maintain it, and I do think that we will find better ways in the future to make sure that voter registration is protected. And on top of that, that if anybody tries to sniff around our voter registration, they're going to be immediately revealed, and that's going to be, very, very helpful. I think we will see the current voting system that we have now, the new one with the paper trail, stay with us for the next 10 or 15 years, and mostly that's because these voting systems are so expensive to replace. We can't really afford to replace them for less than what the lifetime is for the equipment, and that's going to be at least 15 years. Nevertheless, by the time 15 years rolls around, we may have products that are more like StarVote, where we can have third-party verification and where we can have risk-limiting audits to make sure that all of the totals can be justified back to the voter that actually deposited the ballot. that's all new stuff for the future. And I'm looking forward in my next term to working on all those items.
Excellent. Thank you. This is a general question about the Electoral College. And so anyone is welcome to take this one. But it is just basically the thoughts about whether or not the Electoral College is a fair process for voters. When we talk about direct voting, we're really in the presidential election and the presidential race, we're really not directly voting for the president. We're voting for the electors that are going to represent the state. And most of the states have a winner take all model. So just the thoughts, I guess your thoughts on that, on whether that is a fair and equitable way to elect the president when there are virtually no other offices that we use a proxy vote for our direct vote for that candidate.
I'll take a swing at that. Just a quick one. If you're from a city, you don't like the Electoral College because you're basically, the Electoral College puts some weight on geography that isn't necessarily justified by population. But if you're really interested in the country being geographically represented, then you're going to like the Electoral College more. I actually think there's a bigger problem with the composition of the U.S. Senate, which is a component of the Electoral College, than there is with the Electoral College itself. You know, the House is pretty evenly divided, you know, with some rounding. They get a census every 10 years. They divide it by 435. They allocate seats to the states cut them up, and you get more or less equal representation. But Wyoming has fewer people than Houston and 2 senators. So you get that kind of an effect. It's the biggest gerrymander of all the gerrymanders. But again, if the interest is having the whole country geographically represented and not just the people in the population centers, then the Electoral College is a counterweight. How was that for a civics answer and a non-politics answer? Yeah.
Excellent. Here's an ID question, a voter ID question. So in the discussion we discussed, Dana, you were bringing up student IDs. This student's asking, are student IDs as secure as something like a driver's license or a concealed handgun license? Wouldn't that be a reason not to allow student IDs?
I've heard that argument, but I haven't ever seen it carry out in real life. So while I recognize that there are, as Spock says, there are always possibilities, I think it's fair to voters to establish public policy on the basis of probabilities and how we help voters access democracy, not ways that we over-focus on restricting access.
You know, that kind of goes back to the earlier discussion we were having about the burden of proof is always on those that are in the driver's seat of power to explain why the law exists in the first place. And if the burden of access is placed on the voter, then it should be a clear and transparent reason for why that burden is placed on them.
If students shouldn't have to ask why their student ID is not acceptable. If the government is going to say it's not, then it's up to the government to provide an explanation for that. And it cannot be just some general accusation that we've got more fraud, because that's simply not true. Ballot by mail is very well protected, and students and military and overseas and travelers have used ballot by mail for a very long time, since its inception in the Civil War, which Ross pointed out.
Moriah, this is a question for you, and it's really a question dealing with how the presidential candidates disclose information. And so the question is, the second presidential debate, which would have been now, the question, since it was canceled, how much damage do you think this has caused voters and not providing voters with information about the candidate's point of views on certain topics?
It was to me?
No, it's to Moriah.
Oh, okay, great.
I mean, anything that we would have learned in in that next debate, we could still find out. I mean, we know where they stand on the issues, but having that information out there just as much as possible, getting them exposed to, getting everybody to see the candidates as many times as possible and get their answers to the issues, having them directly answer those questions is, of course, always helpful. We want to have those opportunities for voters to see that as many times as possible. I do think that it's unfortunate that the debate is not happening for that reason. To your earlier point about getting as much access to that information as possible.
And the voter guide you have now obviously has the candidates' positions on all sorts of issues. And
right, and we only have responses from one presidential candidate in there currently.
Mm-hmm. So here's actually another question for you. I'm just going to read you the question, and it's related to the League of Women Voters, the actual name of the group. So what exactly has the League of Women Voters done to get male student voters motivated to vote in the 2020 election? So do you want to explain why you have the name the League of Women Voters?
Yeah, I love that question. So we've certainly had it before. So some background, the League of Women Voters was formed all the way back in 1919 during the suffrage movement, right before women even had the right to vote. So that's when it was formed. But of course, we've evolved. We are open to everyone at this point, and our efforts, of course, are inclusive of everyone. Some of the things that we've done this year, for example, including we've had to pivot a little bit, right? So we had a lot of get out the vote events planned that we weren't able to do. So we did some contactless canvassing where we found some likely unregistered households and left them information about how to get registered. And now we've put door hangers on the houses of what we've found from our data to be maybe voters. And of course, we're not seeking out just women. These are for anyone, and for communities specifically that maybe have lower than average turnouts. So, and for students in particular, we have partnered with a number of universities here in the area throughout this year, last year, prepping for this, gearing up for this election to get registration events, educational events, and things like that onto their campuses.
Excellent. This is not on the list, but I want to ask y'all this because this is something that I'm always really curious about in using technology in different ways for really all of your organizations. One of the areas of technology that I think is really vibrant area is geographic information systems, or GIS. How are you using GIS in your organizations, or are you using GIS in your organizations to help understand voting patterns, to help understand demographics and locations of voting polls and polling locations? Is GIS used at all, or are y'all using it at all?
It's pervasive in news coverage now. We use it everything from election maps to demographics about food stamps to, all of that kind of stuff. We get a lot of the information that we used to get sort of explained to us, and we would try to explain it in turn, now comes to us as giant piles of data, and you can feed it into GIS. That's a way to interpret it geographically and to say, here's how this part of the state is like the other part of the state, or different from another part of the state, or here's where a particular problem is. And we've used it a lot during the pandemic to locate hotspots, how when you've got an area as big as Texas and a population the size of this one, parts of the state can be doing perfectly well while other parts of the state are having, tragic surges of this disease. And we found that to be true, ever since March. And that's all GIS work. It's all over the place.
Yeah, for us at Capital Metro, it's vital to our organization and the service we provide. Every route is planned using GIS, and every map you see is made using GIS. It's very, very pervasive in the transit industry, the use of GIS, for sure.
And I think it might be obvious from the answers that I've given before, but it's pretty critical for how we compile our information for the voter's guide, how we determine how to get a voter their customized ballot, and for those get out the vote. initiatives that I discussed before. And I don't even, that's not even my area. I just sit back and when they talk about stuff like that, I'm like, what, how do we even, wow. Okay, great work.
Yeah, kind of a niche profession is someone who knows how to use GIS for sure.
That's amazing.
Yeah. This is a question on the Prop A for Eric, and I'm going to read this from the chat here. I know many citizens in the outlining area and the outlining areas, District 10, for example, is finding that this is unfair to have to pay the expected tax increase in a project that will not be of benefit to them. How do you address this concern? So I guess the question is, what about those that aren't on the routes, that aren't being that aren't included in a location that they feel like they can access the routes? What's in it? So basically, what's in it for them?
Yeah, I think, kind of two responses for that. I think that's, again, going back to neighborhood circulators that I talked about, in places that are less dense, that's a really good option. And we actually have one currently in that area, and there are more proposed in Project Connect that would connect those less dense areas into the larger system. And so I think it was, really critical, that it is a system, like I said before, that gives people options to connect into not just one line, but all the lines. If you go to a lot of other cities, their light rail or their bus system doesn't stop out in front of everyone's front door. I think the idea is, and what we try to do is service, the most amount of people we can. And so I think what's kind of unique about our approach with Project Connect, again, is that we're providing options for all of those different service or market types within the city of Boston: the less dense area, the commuter, the areas that aren't ready yet for light rail, but that enhanced bus service makes a lot of sense. And then in our most dense corridors, light rail. And then I think in terms of, I guess, the universal citizen view is that, it's going to help your neighbors. So and I would say even beyond that, you will benefit from it because, every person who's not on the road is offering you a better experience, whether you're driving, biking, or taking transit. And so I think with any service or public service that whether Cat Metro provides, the county provides, or the city provides, has a community benefit that always needs to be, I personally think, and especially St. Ed's, when you think about the social justice aspect to the teaching, that is important to consider when making your decision, for sure.
So this is something that I'll just ask, and I think you can answer it real quick, Moriah. Where can we find unbiased information on propositions?
So we do that in vote411.org and the voters guide as well. We try, sometimes I've certainly gotten there and looked at the ballot language and I'm like, God, I have no idea what these words are trying to say to me right now. So Vote 411, what we try to do there is put that into, just in case that ballot language is long or has legalese in it that the average voter might not be able to understand. I think personally that Prop A and Prop B are worded well and you should know what you're getting into, but we do still provide an additional explanation to kind of break that down for you. And that's going to be on your ballot if you're voting on it at vote411.org, and the propositions for all the outlying cities as well. Round Rock has some, Lakeway, Cedar Park, all those are in there.
This kind of thinking about propositions and how propositions are on the ballot and are frequently on the ballot. We obviously are not California, where there are much more direct democracy, direct democratic forms of ballot participation. But do you have thoughts, or just in general, the thoughts on the panel about the use of things like referendums? We hear there's Mayor Adler, for example. There's a group in Austin that is certainly wanting to place on the ballot whether to remove Mayor Adler from office. There are city council members that the same. And so obviously these kinds of direct democratic measures are part of democracy. So if the argument is we want participation from the citizens, then is this an effective avenue for participation?
Is it depends a good answer? You know, I mean, you're sort of on a spectrum between order and chaos. My little brother lived in the East Bay area of California for 15 years or so, and, you know, often went to the polls and found a proposition on the ballot that was negated by another proposition on the same ballot. And they would have this giant sorting process at the end to try to figure out which one passed first and by the most votes and prevailed and all of this kind of stuff. If it's orderly, you can do initiative and referendum pretty effectively. And, you know, from a political standpoint, it can let politicians off the hook a little bit, because you can put something in front of voters that, you know, there are issues at any given time that Republicans or Democrats don't want to vote on, because the way they would vote would get them unelected, but they'd be, you know, if they did what they think is the right thing, it would get them knocked out of office. So sometimes when you see something like a constitutional amendment, you know, when Texas comes up and says, when the legislature comes in and says, I don't know, Texas, do you want a lottery? You know, they've gotten off the hook for having to vote on a lottery and voting against or for gambling. They're letting the voters do that. So, you know, there's a way to do it, and Texas has a limited form of it, but there are also lots of examples of it just kind of getting out of hand.
This is another question for Eric and it's very specific on this, on whether the proposition, there are plans to run the train from Leander throughout the day like the rest of the red line stations.
So, you know, so I'm surprised to hear that question, just because I know that we've made enhancements to the red line in terms of when it running all the way to Leander. I would say the reason why it's probably being asked is because in the past year, we had to limit operations, not just to Leander, but throughout the whole line, to implement a federally mandated safety infrastructure called positive train control. That project is now done. And so we anticipate when the pandemic's over and commuter demand returns to previous levels, to be running the frequent service that new infrastructure is going to allow us to run. In fact, another really great development is that downtown station that I talked about at the convention center area, where the blue line will meet the red and the green line, and and the gold line and the other Metro Rapid lines. That station has been in construction already and is set to open, or at least partially open, next week. And so we're really excited about that. And you know, without getting into, you know, how train operations work, but when you add stations like that with multiple bays, it really gives us more flexibility and the timing of the trains and being able to add more frequency. And so the answer is yes, we've been doing stuff before Project Connect to enhance the frequency and efficiency of the red line. But Project Connect will definitely, the really decent initial investment, has funding to add more efficiency through more stations and other infrastructure.
This is a question. It's related. Well, first of all, before it's a question, Dana, there are many comments here thanking you for all of the work that you've put in. So I'll also echo that and thank you for all of the just leadership that you placed on this very difficult time. So many thanks, and you're getting many comments on that. But one in particular that I think is interesting is on the new voting machines. And I would just like to, you know, what does a voting machine cost? What does that cost? You said it's costly, and so when you adopt a new voting machine, then you don't want to change that anytime soon. What does that cost?
All right, our voting system, our brand new voting system, cost $9.1 million. That's a lot of money. We are going to be getting, I believe, some federal help, just like we did with our previous election voting system that we purchased. And the way we're asked to operate this system in the future with protections for voters is also going to cost more. And we're hoping to get some federal funds to help defray some of those costs. To give you an idea, our $9.1 million voting system is working beautifully, and voters seem to really love the fact that they finally have a paper trail. And to give you some idea of how much COVID is costing us, this election should have cost around $2.2 million for just a normal presidential election. And the amount that we're having to spend on this with all of the extra protections is $6.9 million. We've already asked for a grant for $1.1 million, and we're also going to be getting CARES funding to help pay for that. But the idea is that we need to have a stable system at the state and federal level to provide financing for elections, instead of the state and the federal acting surprised every 15 years when a jurisdiction said, you know, it's time to buy a new voting system. We need an escrow account, some sort of a savings account that has a specific revenue all the way through all the years, so that when it comes time to buy a new voting system, it's funded by not just local, but also state and federal partners.
Are any states doing that?
No, not yet. We've been hoping, and the Elections Assistance Commission has been asking for this for several years, that we need a predictable source of income to offset the costs we know are going to be there. It's just like every family that saves up to buy a car or saves up to make a down payment on a new house. It's the same thing. You predict it and plan for it.
One thing you brought up was just the cost of the election under COVID. The shortage of workers as well. I've seen a lot of calls that you've put out on polling workers and is that still a problem? Do you still need workers can college students do that?
Yes, they can. We love college students. But this question gives me an opportunity to give a shout out to the League of Women Voters. The League has been incredibly helpful to us in the July runoff election and in this election in recruiting newer, younger people into the election process. We're thrilled with them. We're talking a couple of hundred people alone recruited by the League of Women Voters over the summer, and many of those people are coming back to help us with November. And it's a lot of techie people, new people, and as a result of that, we've been able to offer our seasoned election judges an opportunity to help us process vote by mail and use their experience there, where there's a little less risk than being inside a polling place. So I do need more people, but the help that we're getting right now and the response from the public is going to really help us in the future make sure that we've got lots of smart, able people who are ready to go to work with our seasoned judges. We really need that. And if you're even a high school student, you can come and help us count ballots on election night. We have a high school program, and you're welcome to join us.
How would they sign up? Do they just go to the Travis County Clerk's website?
That's right. Go to votetravis.com. That website has virtually every answer to every question you can think of, and it will direct you if we need to go another place, like for example to the general county site or to the League of Women Voters site for actual sign up to work. All of that is all connected together, and it's been a real pleasure to work with the League this last 6 or 7 months.
I just have one last question for everybody on the panel. This is, and we're coming up to the end, and I know everybody's time is valuable, and y'all done. It's an hour and a half that we asked. So I just want to tell all of you, and I'm getting comments for how incredible this panel was tonight. So all of you, thank you so much for doing this for the students here at St. Ed's. But the question I have is, we have a lot of very negative overtone in American politics right now. There's a lot of negativity, but at the same time, our voter registration is at the highest that it's been. Participation is high. So I guess if you could say, are you optimistic about the American democratic experience, or are you pessimistic about it, cynical about it? Where would you be on that spectrum?
Well, maybe it's just my natural tendency, but I too do tend to be optimistic about it. The new statistics showing the participation among our younger voters, 18 to 30, is way up. So we sort of feel like, well, thank goodness that young group is finally starting to participate in voting, and we really hope they're going to make it a habit for life. It's much more helpful the more people we have involved in our democracy, and that's such an obvious statement to make.
What about everybody else? Ross, what do you think? Or Moriah, what do you think?
I guess it just depends on what day it is. No, someday, truly though, someday, I'll admit some days I do feel like I'm falling into a pit of despair, but when I think of all of it, you know, I wouldn't do what I do. The League is an all volunteer organization. What I'm doing for the League it's purely volunteer, and I wouldn't be involved with something if I wasn't so passionate about it. So I'm optimistic, and I love being a part of the democratic, you know, process. It's something I'm really passionate about, and I'm thrilled to see other people passionate about it as well.
I'm an optimist. You know, we invented this system so that we could settle big differences on things that we really care a lot about without violence. And you know, an election is a fight. Legislative building the Capitol is a fighting box. That's where we take our disagreements, and oftentimes, you know, from time to time, the disagreements get pretty pitched and get pretty nasty. And you know, we're in one of those times right now, but we always seem to work it out, and I'm an optimist about it, and I believe in it and think it works. And I think most people do too. I guess we're about to get we'll know in 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, I'm also an optimist when it comes to these things. Obviously, I'm a public servant, just like the clerk here, and so it's hard. And obviously, just like the League of Women Voters, you know, very invested in the system, and so it's, you know, definitely something that I think has issues that always need to be resolved. But that's the beauty of the system, right? Per Ross's per what Ross was saying, that, you know, it's up to us every day to make our communities better, and this is one way you can do that.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to tell y'all again how much we appreciate you coming tonight, and I mean, it was a very, very good session. So thank y'all so much, and look forward to the next few weeks. And I know Dana, you're probably looking forward to the November 4th. So thank y'all so much, and have a great night. And thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
You bet. Take care.